Master word list. Words starting with letter A. Abase means lower, humiliate. For example, defeated Queen Zenobia was forced to abase herself before the conquering Romans, who made her march in chains before the emperor in the procession celebrating his triumph. Abash means embarrass. For example, he was not at all abashed by her open admiration. Abate means subside, decrease. For example, rather than leaving immediately, they waited for the storm to abate. Abbreviate means shorten. For example, because we were running out of time, the lecturer had to abbreviate her speech. Abdicate means renounce, give up. For example, when Edward VIII abdicated the British throne to marry the woman he loved, he surprised the entire world. Abduction means kidnapping. For example, the movie Ransom describes the attempts to rescue a multi-millionaire's son after the child's abduction by kidnappers. Aberrant means abnormal or deviant. For example, given the aberrant nature of the data, we doubted the validity of the entire experiment. Abet means aid, usually in doing something wrong. For example, she was unwilling to abet him in the swindle he had planned. Abeyance means suspended action. For example, the deal was held in abeyance until her arrival. Abhor means detest, hate. For example, she abhorred all forms of bigotry. Abject means wretched, lacking pride. For example, on the streets of New York the homeless live in abject poverty, huddling in doorways to find shelter from the wind. Abjure means renounce upon oath. For example, he abjured his allegiance to the king. Ablution means washing. For example, his daily ablutions were accompanied by loud noises that he humorously labeled opera in the bath. Abnegation means repudiation, self-sacrifice. For example, no act of abnegation was more pronounced than his refusal of any rewards for his discovery. Abolish means cancel, put an end to. For example, the president of the college refused to abolish the physical education requirement. Abominable means extremely unpleasant, very bad. For example, Mary liked John until she learned he was dating Susan, then she called him an abominable young man, with abominable taste in women. Aboriginal means primitive, native. For example, her studies of the primitive art forms of the Aboriginal Indians were widely reported in the scientific journals. Abortive means unsuccessful, fruitless. For example, attacked by armed troops, the Chinese students had to abandon their abortive attempt to democratize Beijing peacefully. Abrade means scrape, erode. For example, the sharp rocks abraded the skin on her legs, so she put iodine on her abrasions. Abrasive means rubbing away. For example, just as abrasive cleaning powders can wear away a shiny finish, abrasive remarks can wear away a listener's patience. Abridge means condense or shorten. For example, because the publishers felt the public wanted a shorter version of War and Peace, they proceeded to abridge the novel. Abrogate means abolish. For example, he intended to abrogate the decree issued by his predecessor. Abscond means depart secretly and hide. For example, the teller who absconded with the bonds went uncaptured until someone recognized him from his photograph on America's Most Wanted. Absolute means complete, totally unlimited, certain. For example, although the king of Siam was an absolute monarch, he did not want to behead his unfaithful wife without absolute evidence of her infidelity. Absolve means pardon. For example, the father confessor absolved him of his sins. Absorb means incorporate, suck or drink up. For example, during the 19th century, America absorbed hordes of immigrants, turning them into productive citizens. Abstain means refrain. For example, after considering the effect of alcohol on his athletic performance, he decided to abstain from drinking while he trained for the race. Abstemious means sparing in eating and drinking. For example, concerned whether her vegetarian son's abstemious diet provided him with sufficient protein, the worried mother pressed food on him. Abstinence means restraint from eating or drinking. For example, the doctor recommended total abstinence from salted foods. Abstract means theoretical, not concrete. For example, to him, hunger was an abstract concept, he had never missed a meal. Abstruse means profound, difficult to understand. For example, she carries around abstruse works of philosophy, not because she understands them but because she wants her friends to think she does. Abundant means plentiful. For example, at his immigration interview, Ivan listed his abundant reasons for coming to America: the hope of religious freedom, the prospect of employment, the promise of a more abundant life. Abusive means insulting, physically harmful. For example, an abusive parent damages a child both mentally and physically. Abut means border upon, adjoin. For example, where our estates abut, we must build a fence. Abysmal means bottomless. For example, his arrogance is exceeded only by his abysmal ignorance. Abyss means enormous chasm. For example, Darth Vader seized the evil emperor and hurled him down into the abyss. Academic means related to a school. For example, the dean's talk about reforming the college admissions system was only an academic discussion. We knew little, if anything, would change. Accede means agree. For example, if I accede to this demand for blackmail, I am afraid that I will be the victim of future demands. Accelerate means move faster. For example, in our science class, we learn how falling bodies accelerate. Accentuate means emphasize, stress. For example, if you accentuate the positive and eliminate the negative, you may wind up with an over-optimistic view of the world. Accessible means easy to approach, obtainable. For example, we asked our guide whether the ruins were accessible on foot. Accessory means useful but not essential thing. For example, she bought an attractive handbag as an accessory for her dress. Acclaim means applaud, announce with great approval. For example, the NBC sportscasters acclaimed every American victory in the Olympics and decried every American defeat. Acclimate means adjust to climate. For example, one of the difficulties of our present air age is the need of travelers to acclimate themselves to their new and often strange environments. Acclivity means sharp upslope of a hill. For example, the car would not go up the acclivity in high gear. Accolade means award of merit. For example, in Hollywood, an Oscar is the highest accolade. Accommodate means help someone adapt. For example, Mitch always did everything possible to accommodate his elderly relatives, from driving them to medical appointments to helping them with paperwork. Accomplice means partner in crime. For example, because he had provided the criminal with the lethal weapon, he was arrested as an accomplice in the murder. Accord means agreement. For example, she was in complete accord with the verdict. Accost means approach and speak first to a person. For example, when the two young men accosted me, I was frightened because I thought they were going to attack me. Accoutre means equip. For example, the fisherman was accoutred with the best that the sporting goods store could supply. Accretion means growth, increase. For example, the accretion of wealth marked the family's rise in power. Accrue means come about by addition. For example, you must pay the interest that has accrued on your debt as well as the principal sum. Acerbity means bitterness of speech and temper. For example, the meeting of the United Nations General Assembly was marked with such acerbity that informed sources held out little hope of reaching any useful settlement of the problem. Acetic means vinegary. For example, the salad had an exceedingly acetic flavor. Acidulous means slightly sour, sharp. For example, James was unpopular because of his sarcastic and acidulous remarks. Acknowledge means recognize, admit. For example, although I acknowledge that the Beatles' tunes sound pretty dated today, I still prefer them to the gangsta rap songs my brothers play. Acme means top, pinnacle. For example, his success in this role marked the acme of his career as an actor. Acoustics means science of sound. For example, Carnegie Hall is liked by music lovers because of its fine acoustics. Acquiesce means assent, agree without protesting. For example, although she appeared to acquiesce to her employer's suggestions, I could tell she had reservations about the changes he wanted made. Acquire means obtain, get. For example, Frederick Douglass was determined to acquire an education despite his master's efforts to prevent his doing so. Acquittal means deliverance from a charge. For example, his acquittal by the jury surprised those who had thought him guilty. Acrid means bitterly pungent. For example, the acrid odor of burnt gunpowder filled the room after the pistol had been fired. Acrimonious means bitter in words or manner. For example, the candidate attacked his opponent in highly acrimonious terms. Acrophobia means fear of heights. For example, a born salesman, he could convince someone with a bad case of acrophobia to sign up for a life membership in a skydiving club. Actuarial means pertaining to insurance statistics. For example, according to recent actuarial tables, life expectancy is greater today than it was a century ago. Actuate means motivate. For example, I fail to understand what actuated you to reply to this letter so nastily. Acuity means sharpness. For example, in time his youthful acuity of vision failed him, and he needed glasses. Acumen means mental keenness. For example, his business acumen helped him to succeed where others had failed. Acute means keen, brief and severe. For example, the acute young doctor realized immediately that the gradual deterioration of her patient's once acute hearing was due to a chronic illness, not an acute one. Adage means wise saying, proverb. For example, there is much truth in the old adage about fools and their money. Adamant means hard, inflexible. For example, Bronson played the part of a revenge-driven man, adamant in his determination to punish the criminals who destroyed his family. Adopt means alter, modify. For example, some species of animals have become extinct because they could not adapt to a changing environment. Addendum means an addition or supplement. For example, as an addendum to the minutes, let me point out that Susan moved to appoint Kathy and Arthur to the Finance Committee. Addiction means compulsive, habitual need. For example, his addiction to drugs caused his friends much grief. Addle means drive crazy, become rotten. For example, this idiotic plan is confusing enough to addle anyone. Address means direct a speech to, deal with or discuss. For example, due to address the convention in July, Brown planned to address the issue of low-income housing in his speech. Adept means expert at. For example, she was adept at the fine art of irritating people. Adhere means stick fast. For example, I will adhere to this opinion until proof that I am wrong is presented. Adherent means supporter, follower. For example, in the wake of the scandal, the senator's one-time adherents quickly deserted him. Adjacent means adjoining, neighboring, close by. For example, Philip's best friend Jason lived only 4 houses down the block, close but not immediately adjacent. Adjunct means something added on or attached. For example, although I don't absolutely need a second computer, I plan to buy a laptop to serve as an adjunct to my desktop model. Admonish means warn, reprove. For example, he admonished his listeners to change their wicked ways. Admonition means warning. For example, after the student protesters repeatedly rejected Chairman Deng's admonitions, the government issued an ultimatum: either the students would end the demonstration at once or the soldiers would fire on the crowd. Adorn means decorate. For example, wall paintings and carved statues adorned the temple. Adroit means skillful. For example, his adroit handling of the delicate situation pleased his employers. Adulation means flattery, admiration. For example, the rock star thrived on the adulation of his groupies and yes men. Adulterate means make impure by adding inferior substances. For example, it is a crime to adulterate foods without informing the buyer. When consumers learned that Beechnut had adulterated their apple juice by mixing it with water, they protested vigorously. Advent means arrival. For example, most Americans were unaware of the advent of the nuclear age until the news of Hiroshima reached them. Adventitious means accidental, casual. For example, he found this adventitious meeting with his friend extremely fortunate. Adversary means opponent. For example, the young wrestler struggled to defeat his adversary. Adverse means unfavorable, hostile. For example, the recession had a highly adverse effect on father's investment portfolio. He lost so much money that he could no longer afford the butler and the upstairs maid. Adversity means poverty, misfortune. For example, we must learn to meet adversity gracefully. Advocacy means support, active pleading on something's behalf. For example, no threats could dissuade Bishop Desmond Tutu from his advocacy of the human rights of black South Africans. Advocate means urge, plead for. For example, the abolitionists advocated freedom for the slaves. Eyrie means nest of a large bird of prey. For example, the mother eagle swooped down on the unwitting rabbit and bore it off to her eyrie high in the Rocky Mountains. Aesthetic means artistic, dealing with appreciation of the beautiful. For example, the beauty of Tiffany's stained glass appealed to Esther's aesthetic sense. Affable means easily approachable, warmly friendly. For example, accustomed to cold, aloof supervisors, Nicholas was amazed at how affable his new employer was. Affected means artificial, pretended. For example, his affected mannerisms, his Harvard accent, his air of boredom, his use of obscure foreign words bugged us. he acted as if he thought he was too good for his old high school friends. Affidavit means written statement made under oath. For example, the court refused to accept his statement unless he presented it in the form of an affidavit. Affiliation means joining, associating with. For example, his affiliation with the political party was of short duration, for he soon disagreed with his colleagues. Affinity means kinship. For example, she felt an affinity with all who suffered, their pains were her pains. Affirmation means positive assertion, confirmation. For example, despite Tom's affirmations of innocence, Aunt Polly still suspected he had eaten the pie. Affix means fasten, attach. For example, first the registrar had to affix her signature to the license, then she had to affix her official seal. Affliction means state of distress, cause of suffering. For example, even in the midst of her affliction, Elizabeth tried to keep up the spirits of those around her. Affluence means abundance, wealth. For example, foreigners are amazed by the affluence and luxury of the American way of life. Affront means insult, offense, intentional act of disrespect. For example, when Mrs. Prouty was not seated beside the Archdeacon at the head table, she took it as a personal affront and refused to speak to her hosts for a week. Aftermath means consequences, outcome. For example, people around the world wondered what the aftermath of China's violent suppression of the student protests would be. Agenda means items of business at a meeting. For example, we had so much difficulty agreeing upon an agenda that there was very little time for the meeting. Agent means personal representative. For example, I will be the agent of America's destruction, proclaimed the beady-eyed villain, whose agent had gotten him the role. With his face, he could never have played the part of the hero, a heroic FBI agent. Agglomeration means collection, heap. For example, it took weeks to assort the agglomeration of miscellaneous items she had collected on her trip. Aggrandize means increase or intensify. For example, the history of the past quarter century illustrates how a president may aggrandize his power to act aggressively in international affairs without considering the wishes of Congress. Aggregate means gather, accumulate. For example, before the Wall Street scandals, dealers in so-called junk bonds managed to aggregate great wealth in short periods of time. Aggressor means attacker. For example, before you punish both boys for fighting, see whether you can determine which one was the aggressor. Aghast means horrified. For example, he was aghast at the nerve of the speaker who had insulted his host. Agility means nimbleness. For example, the agility of the acrobat amazed and thrilled the audience. Agitate means stir up, disturb. For example, her fiery remarks agitated the already angry mob. Agnostic means one who is skeptical. For example, agnostics say we can neither prove nor disprove the existence of God, we simply just can't know. Agrarian means pertaining to land or its cultivation. For example, the country is gradually losing its agrarian occupation and turning more and more to an industrial point of view. Alacrity means cheerful promptness. For example, Phil and Dave were raring to get off to the mountains. They packed up their ski gear and climbed into the van with alacrity. Alchemy means medieval chemistry. For example, the changing of baser metals into gold was the goal of the students of alchemy. Alcove means small, recessed section of a room. For example, though their apartment lacked a full-scale dining room, an alcove adjacent to the living room made an adequate breakfast nook for the young couple. Alias means an assumed name. For example, John Smith's alias was Bob Jones. Alienate means make hostile, separate. For example, her attempts to alienate the two friends failed because they had complete faith in each other. Alimentary means supplying nourishment. For example, the alimentary canal in our bodies is so named because digestion of foods occurs there. Alimony means payment by a husband to his divorced wife. For example, Mrs. Jones was awarded $200 monthly alimony by the court when she was divorced from her husband. Allay means calm, pacify. For example, the crew tried to allay the fears of the passengers by announcing that the fire had been controlled. Allege means state without proof. For example, although it is alleged that she has worked for the enemy, she denies the allegation and, legally, we can take no action against her without proof. Allegiance means loyalty. For example, not even a term in prison could shake Lech Wałęsa's allegiance to Solidarity, the Polish trade union he had helped to found. Allegory means fable. For example, Pilgrim's Progress is an allegory of the temptations and victories of man's soul. Alleviate means relieve. For example, this should alleviate the pain. If it does not, we shall have to use stronger drugs. Alliteration means repetition of beginning sound in poetry. For example, the furrow followed free is an example of alliteration. Allocate means assign. For example, even though the Red Cross had allocated a large sum for the relief of the sufferers of the disaster, many people perished. Alloy means a mixture as of metals. For example, alloys of gold are used more frequently than the pure metal. Alloy means mix, make less pure. For example, our delight at the Yankees' victory was alloyed by our concern for Dwight Gooden, who injured his pitching arm in the game. Allude means refer indirectly. For example, try not to mention divorce in Jack's presence because he will think you are alluding to his marital problems with Jill. Allure means entice, attract. For example, allured by the song of the sirens, the helmsman steered the ship toward the reef. Allusion means indirect reference. For example, when Amanda said to the ticket scalper, $100. What do you want, a pound of flesh? She was making an allusion to Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice. Aloft means upward. For example, the sailor climbed aloft into the rigging. To get into a loft bed, you have to climb aloft. Aloof means apart, reserved. For example, shy by nature, she remained aloof while all the rest conversed. Altercation means noisy quarrel, heated dispute. For example, in that hot-tempered household, no meal ever came to a peaceful conclusion. The inevitable altercation might even end in blows. Altruistic means unselfishly generous, concerned for others. For example, in providing tutorial assistance and college scholarships for hundreds of economically disadvantaged youths, Eugene Lang performed a truly altruistic deed. Amalgamate means combine, unite in one body. For example, the unions will attempt to amalgamate their groups into one national body. Amass means collect. For example, the miser's aim is to amass and hoard as much gold as possible. Ambidextrous means capable of using either hand with equal ease. For example, a switch hitter in baseball should be naturally ambidextrous. Ambience means environment, atmosphere. For example, she went to the restaurant not for the food but for the ambience. Ambiguous means unclear or doubtful in meaning. For example, his ambiguous instructions misled us. We did not know which road to take. Ambivalence means the state of having contradictory emotional attitudes. For example, torn between loving her parents one minute and hating them the next, she was confused by the ambivalence of her feelings. Amble means moving at an easy pace. For example, when she first mounted the horse, she was afraid to urge the animal to go faster than a gentle amble. Ambulatory means able to walk, not bedridden. For example, Juan was a highly ambulatory patient. Not only did he refuse to be confined to bed, but he insisted on riding his skateboard up and down the halls. Ameliorate means improve. For example, many social workers have attempted to ameliorate the conditions of people living in the slums. Amenable means readily managed, willing to be led. For example, he was amenable to any suggestions that came from those he looked up to. He resented advice from his inferiors. Amend means correct, change. For example, hoping to amend his condition, he left Vietnam for the United States. Amenities means convenient features. For example, in addition to the customary amenities for the business traveler fax machines, modems, a health club, the hotel offers the services of a butler versed in the social amenities. Amiable means agreeable, warmly friendly. For example, in Little Women, Beth is the amiable daughter whose loving disposition endears her to all who know her. Amicable means politely friendly, not quarrelsome. For example, Beth's sister Jo is the hot-tempered tomboy who has a hard time maintaining amicable relations with those around her. Amiss means wrong, faulty. For example, seeing her frown, he wondered if anything were amiss. Amity means friendship. For example, student exchange programs such as the Experiment in International Living were established to promote international amity. Amnesia means loss of memory. For example, because she was suffering from amnesia, the police could not get the young girl to identify herself. Amnesty means pardon. For example, when his first child was born, the king granted amnesty to all in prison. Amoral means non-moral. For example, the amoral individual lacks a code of ethics, he cannot tell right from wrong. Amorous means loving. For example, love them and leave them was the motto of the amorous Don Juan. Amorphous means formless, lacking shape. For example, as soon as we have decided on our itinerary, we shall send you a copy. Right now, our plans are still amorphous. Amphibian means able to live both on land and in water. For example, frogs are classified as amphibian. Amphitheater means oval building with tiers of seats. For example, the spectators in the amphitheater cheered the gladiators. Ample means abundant. For example, Bond had ample opportunity to escape. Why did he let us catch him? Amplify means broaden by expanding, intensify. For example, Charlie Brown tried to amplify his remarks, but he was drowned out by jeers from the audience. Amputate means cut off part of body, prune. For example, when the doctors had to amputate the young man's leg to prevent the spread of cancer, he did not let the loss of a limb keep him from participating in sports. Analgesic means causing insensitivity to pain. For example, the analgesic qualities of this lotion will provide temporary relief. Amulet means charm. For example, around her neck she wore the amulet that the witch doctor had given her. Anachronistic means having an error involving time in a story. For example, the reference to clocks in Julius Caesar is anachronistic. Clocks did not exist in Caesar's time. Analogous means comparable. For example, she called our attention to the things that had been done in an analogous situation and recommended that we do the same. Analogy means similarity, parallelism. For example, a well-known analogy compares the body's immune system with an army whose defending troops are the lymphocytes or white blood cells. Anarchist means person who seeks to overturn the established government. For example, denying she was an anarchist, Katya maintained she wished only to make changes in our government, not to destroy it entirely. Anarchy means absence of governing body. For example, the assassination of the leaders led to a period of anarchy. Anathema means solemn curse, someone regarded as a curse. For example, the Ayatollah Khomeini heaped anathema upon the great Satan, that is, the United States. Ancestry means family descent. For example, David can trace his ancestry as far back as the 17th century, when one of his ancestors was a court trumpeter somewhere in Germany. Anchor means secure or fasten firmly. For example, we set the post in concrete to anchor it in place. Ancillary means serving as an aid or accessory, auxiliary. For example, in an ancillary capacity, Dr. Watson was helpful. However, Holmes could not trust the good doctor to solve a perplexing case on his own. Anecdote means short account of an amusing or interesting event. For example, rather than make concrete proposals for welfare reform, President Reagan told anecdotes about poor people who became wealthy despite their impoverished backgrounds. Anemia means condition in which blood lacks red corpuscles. For example, the doctor ascribes her tiredness to anemia. Anesthetic means substance that removes sensation with or without loss of consciousness. For example, his monotonous voice acted like an anesthetic. His audience was soon asleep. Anguish means acute pain, extreme suffering. For example, visiting the site of the explosion, the governor wept to see the anguish of the victims and their families. Angular means sharp-cornered, stiff in manner. For example, Mr. Spock's features, though angular, were curiously attractive, in a Vulcan way. Animated means lively, spirited. For example, Jim Carrey's facial expressions are highly animated. When he played Ace Ventura, he looked practically rubber-faced. Animosity means active enmity. For example, he incurred the animosity of the ruling class because he advocated limitations of their power. Animus means hostile feeling or intent. For example, the animus of the speaker became obvious to all when he began to indulge in sarcastic and insulting remarks. Annals means records, history. For example, in the annals of this period, we find no mention of democratic movements. Annex means attach, take possession of. For example, Mexico objected to the United States' attempts to annex the territory that later became the state of Texas. Annihilate means destroy. For example, the enemy in its revenge tried to annihilate the entire population. Annotate means comment, make explanatory notes. For example, in the appendix to the novel, the editor sought to annotate many of the author's more esoteric references. Annuity means yearly allowance. For example, the annuity he set up with the insurance company supplements his Social Security benefits so that he can live very comfortably without working. Annul means make void. For example, the parents of the eloped couple try to annul the marriage. Anoint means consecrate. For example, the prophet Samuel anointed David with oil, crowning him king of Israel. Anomalous means abnormal, irregular. For example, he was placed in the anomalous position of seeming to approve procedures which he despised. Anomaly means irregularity. For example, a bird that cannot fly is an anomaly. Anonymity means state of being nameless, anonymous. For example, the donor of the gift asked the college not to mention him by name. The dean readily agreed to respect his anonymity. Anonymous means having no name. For example, she tried to ascertain the identity of the writer of the anonymous letter. Antagonism means hostility, active resistance. For example, Barry showed his antagonism toward his new stepmother by ignoring her whenever she tried talking to him. Antecede means precede. For example, the invention of the radiotelegraph anteceded the development of television by a quarter of a century. Antecedents means ancestors. For example, smuggled out of Germany and adopted by a Christian family, she knew nothing of her birth and antecedents until she was reunited with her family in 1989. Antediluvian means antiquated, extremely ancient. For example, looking at his great-aunt's antique furniture, which must have been cluttering up her attic since the time of Noah's flood, the young heir exclaimed, "Heavens! How positively antediluvian!" Anthem means song of praise or patriotism. For example, let us now all join in singing the national anthem. Anthology means book of literary selections by various authors. For example, this anthology of science fiction was compiled by the late Isaac Asimov. Anthropocentric means regarding human beings as the center of the universe. For example, without considering any evidence that might challenge his anthropocentric viewpoint, Hector categorically maintained that dolphins could not be as intelligent as men. Anthropoid means manlike. For example, the gorilla is the strongest of the anthropoid animals. Anthropologist means a student of the history and science of mankind. For example, anthropologists have discovered several relics of prehistoric man in this area. Anthropomorphic means having human form or characteristics. For example, primitive religions often have deities with anthropomorphic characteristics. Anti-climax means let down in thought or emotion. For example, after the fine performance in the first act, the rest of the play was an anticlimax. Antidote means medicine to counteract a poison or disease. For example, when Marge's child accidentally swallowed some cleaning fluid, the local poison control hotline instructed Marge how to administer the antidote. Antipathy means aversion, dislike. For example, Tom's extreme antipathy for disputes keeps him from getting into arguments with his temperamental wife. Antiquated means old-fashioned, obsolete. For example, Philip had grown so accustomed to editing his papers on word processors that he thought typewriters were too antiquated for him to use. Antiseptic means substance that prevents infection. For example, it is advisable to apply an antiseptic to any wound, no matter how slight or insignificant. Antithesis means contrast, direct opposite of or to. For example, this tyranny was the antithesis of all that he had hoped for, and he fought it with all his strength. Apathy means lack of caring, indifference. For example, a firm believer in democratic government, she could not understand the apathy of people who never bothered to vote. Ape means imitate or mimic. For example, he was suspended for a week because he had aped the principal in front of the whole school. Aperture means opening, hole. For example, she discovered a small aperture in the wall, through which the insects had entered the room. Apex means tip, summit, climax. For example, he was at the apex of his career, he had climbed to the top of the heap. Aphasia means loss of speech due to injury. For example, after the automobile accident, the victim had periods of aphasia when he could not speak at all or could only mumble incoherently. Aphorism means pithy maxim. For example, an aphorism differs from an adage in that it is more philosophical or scientific. Apiary means a place where bees are kept. For example, although he spent many hours daily in the apiary, he was very seldom stung by a bee. Aplomb means poise, assurance. For example, Gwen's aplomb in handling potentially embarrassing moments was legendary around the office. When one of her clients broke a piece of her best crystal, she coolly picked up her own goblet and hurled it into the fireplace. Apocalyptic means prophetic, pertaining to revelations. For example, the crowd jeered at the street preacher's apocalyptic predictions of doom. Apocryphal means untrue, made up. For example, to impress his friends, Tom invented apocryphal tales of his adventures in the big city. Apogee means highest point. For example, when the moon in its orbit is farthest away from the Earth, it is at its apogee. Apolitical means having a lack of concern for political affairs. For example, it was hard to remain apolitical during the Vietnam War. Even people who generally ignored public issues felt they had to take political stands. Apologist means one who writes in defense of a cause. For example, rather than act as an apologist for the current regime in Beijing and defend its brutal actions, the young diplomat decided to defect to the West. Apostate means one who abandons his religious faith or political beliefs. For example, because he switched from one party to another, his former friends shunned him as an apostate. Apotheosis means an ideal example of something. For example, the apotheosis of a Roman emperor was designed to ensure his eternal greatness. People would worship at his altar forever. Appall means dismay, shock. For example, we were appalled by the horrifying conditions in the city's jails. Apparatus means equipment. For example, Firefighters use specialized apparatus to fight fires. Apparition means ghost, phantom. For example, on the castle battlements, an apparition materialized and spoke to Hamlet, warning him of his uncle's treachery. Appease means pacify or soothe, relieve. For example, Tom and Jody tried to appease the crying baby by offering him one toy after another, but he would not calm down until they appeased his hunger by giving him a bottle. Appellation means name, title. For example, Macbeth was startled when the witches greeted him with an incorrect appellation. Append means attach. For example, when you append a bibliography to a text, you have just created an appendix. Application means diligent attention. For example, pleased with how well Tom had whitewashed the fence, Aunt Polly praised him for his application to the task. Apposite means appropriate, fitting. For example, he was always able to find the apposite phrase, the correct expression for every occasion. Appraise means estimate value of. For example, it is difficult to appraise the value of old paintings, it is easier to call them priceless. Appreciate means be thankful for, increase in worth. For example, little orphan Annie truly appreciated the stocks Daddy Warbucks gave her, which appreciated in value considerably over the years. Apprehend means arrest. For example, the police will apprehend the culprit and convict him before long. Apprehension means fear. For example, his nervous glances at the passers-by on the deserted street revealed his apprehension. Apprenticeship means time spent as a novice learning a trade. For example, as a child, Pip had thought it would be wonderful to work as Joe's apprentice. Now he hated his apprenticeship and scorned the blacksmith's trade. Apprise means inform. For example, when he was apprised of the dangerous weather conditions, he decided to postpone his trip. Approbation means approval. For example, she looked for some sign of approbation from her parents, hoping her good grades would please them. Appropriate means take possession of for one's own use. For example, the ranch owners appropriated the lands that had originally been set aside for the Indians' use. Apropos means with reference to, regarding. For example, I find your remarks apropos of the present situation timely and pertinent. Aptitude means fitness, talent. For example, the counselor gave him an aptitude test before advising him about the career he should follow. Aquatic means pertaining to water. For example, Paul enjoyed aquatic sports such as scuba diving and snorkeling. Aquiline means curved, hooked. For example, he can be recognized by his aquiline nose, curved like the beak of the eagle. Arable means fit for growing crops. For example, the first settlers wrote home-blowing reports of the New World, praising its vast acres of arable land ready for the plow. Arbiter means person with power to decide a dispute. For example, as an arbiter in labor disputes, she has won the confidence of the workers and the employers. Arbitrary means capricious, randomly chosen. For example, Tom's arbitrary dismissal angered him. His boss had no reason to fire him. Arbitrator means judge. For example, because the negotiating teams had been unable to reach a contract settlement, an outside arbitrator was called upon to mediate the dispute between union and management. Arboretum means place where different tree varieties are exhibited. For example, walking along the tree-lined paths of the Arboretum, Rita noted poplars, firs, and some particularly fine sycamores. Arcade means a covered passageway, usually lined with shops. For example, the arcade was popular with shoppers because it gave them protection from the summer sun and the winter rain. Arcane means secret, mysterious. For example, secret brotherhoods surround themselves with arcane rituals and trappings to mystify outsiders. Archaeology means study of artifacts of early mankind. For example, the professor of archaeology headed an expedition to the Gobi Desert in search of ancient ruins. Archaic means antiquated. For example, methinks, thee, and thou are archaic words that are no longer part of our normal vocabulary. Archetype means prototype, primitive pattern. For example, the Brooklyn Bridge was the archetype of the many spans that now connect Manhattan with Long Island and New Jersey. Archipelago means group of closely located islands. For example, when Gauguin looked at the map and saw the archipelagos in the South Seas, he longed to visit them. Archives means place where public records are kept. For example, these documents should be part of the archives so that historians may be able to evaluate them in the future. Ardent means intense, passionate. For example, Katya's ardor was contagious. Soon all her fellow demonstrators were busily making posters and handing out flyers, inspired by her ardent enthusiasm for the cause. Arduous means hard, strenuous. For example, her arduous efforts had sapped her energy. Aria means operatic solo. For example, at her Metropolitan Opera audition, Marian Anderson sang an aria from Norma. Arid means dry, barren. For example, the cactus has adapted to survive in an arid environment. Aristocracy means hereditary nobility, privileged class. For example, Americans have mixed feelings about hereditary aristocracy. Armada means fleet of warships. For example, Queen Elizabeth's navy defeated the mighty armada that threatened the English coast. Aromatic means fragrant. For example, medieval sailing vessels brought aromatic herbs from China to Europe. Arousal means awakening, provocation. For example, on arousal, Papa was always grumpy as a bear. Arraign means charge in court. For example, after his indictment by the grand jury, the accused man was arraigned in the county criminal court. Array means marshal, draw up in order. For example, his actions were bound to array public sentiment against him. Array means clothe, adorn. For example, she liked to watch her mother array herself in her finest clothes before going out for the evening. Arrears means being in debt. For example, he was in arrears with his payments on the car. Arrest means stop or slow down. For example, slipping, the trapeze artist plunged from the heights until a safety net luckily arrested his fall. Arrogance means pride. For example, convinced that Emma thought she was better than anyone else in the class, Ed rebuked her for her arrogance. Arroyo means gully. For example, until the heavy rains of the past spring, this arroyo had been a dry bed. Arsenal means storage place for military equipment. For example, people are forbidden to smoke in the arsenal for fear that a stray spark might set off the munitions stored there. Articulate means effective, distinct. For example, her articulate presentation of the advertising campaign impressed her employers. Artifact means object made by human beings. For example, archaeologists debated the significance of the artifacts discovered in the ruins of Asia Minor but came to no conclusion about the culture they represented. Artifice means deception, trickery. For example, the Trojan War proved to the Greeks that cunning and artifice were often more effective than military might. Artisan means manually skilled worker, craftsman. For example, a noted artisan, Arturo was known for the fine craftsmanship of his inlaid cabinets. Artless means without guile, open and honest. For example, sophisticated and cynical, Jack could not believe Jill was as artless and naive as she appeared to be. Ascendancy means controlling influence, domination. For example, leaders of religious cults maintain ascendancy over their followers by methods that converge on brainwashing. Ascertain means find out for certain. For example, please ascertain her present address. Ascetic means practicing self-denial. For example, the wealthy, self-indulgent young man felt oddly drawn to the strict, ascetic life led by members of some monastic orders. Ascribe means refer, attribute, assign. For example, I can ascribe no motive for her acts. Aseptic means preventing infection, having a cleansing effect. For example, hospitals succeeded in lowering the mortality rate as soon as they introduced aseptic conditions. Ashen means ash-colored. For example, her face was ashen with fear. Asinine means stupid. For example, your asinine remarks prove that you have not given this problem any serious consideration. Askance means with a sideways or indirect look. For example, looking askance at her questioner, she displayed her scorn. Askew means crookedly, slanted. For example, when he placed his hat askew upon his head, his observers laughed. Asperity means sharpness. For example, these remarks, spoken with asperity, stung the boys to whom they had been directed. Aspirant means seeker after position or status. For example, although I am an aspirant for public office, I am not willing to accept the dictates of the party bosses. Aspire means seek to attain, long for. For example, because he aspired to a career in professional sports, Philip enrolled in a graduate program in sports management. Assail means assault. For example, he was assailed with questions after his lecture. Assay means analyze, evaluate. For example, when they assayed the ore, they found that they had discovered a very rich vein. Assent means agree, accept. For example, it gives me great pleasure to assent to your request. Assert means declare with confidence. For example, Malcolm asserted that if Reese quit acting like a wimp and asserted himself a bit more, he'd improve his chances of getting a date. Assessment means evaluation, judgment. For example, your SATI score plays a part in the admission committee's assessment of you as an applicant. Assiduous means diligent. For example, he was assiduous, working at this task for weeks before he felt satisfied with his results. Assimilate means absorb. For example, the manner in which the United States was able to assimilate the hordes of immigrants during the 19th and early 20th centuries will always be a source of pride to Americans. Assuage means ease or lessen, satisfy. For example, jilted by Jane, Dick tried to assuage his heartache by indulging in ice cream. Assumption means something taken for granted. For example, the young princess made the foolish assumption that the regent would not object to her assumption of power. Assurance means promise or pledge. For example, when Guthrie gave Guinness his assurance that rehearsals were going well, he spoke with such assurance that Guinness felt relieved. Asteroid means small planet. For example, asteroids have become commonplace to the readers of interstellar travel stories in science fiction magazines. Astigmatism means eye defect that prevents proper focus. For example, as soon as his parents discovered that the boy suffered from astigmatism, they took him to the optometrist for corrective glasses. Astral means relating to the stars. For example, she was amazed at the number of astral bodies the new telescope revealed. Astringent means binding, causing contraction. For example, the astringent quality of the unsweetened lemon juice made swallowing difficult. Astronomical means enormously large or extensive. For example, the government seems willing to spend astronomical sums on weapons development. Astute means wise, shrewd, keen. For example, the painter was an astute observer, noticing every tiny detail of her model's appearance and knowing exactly how important each one was. Asunder means into parts, apart. For example, a fierce quarrel split the partnership asunder. The two partners finally sundered their connections because their points of view were poles asunder. Asylum means place of refuge or shelter, protection. For example, the refugees sought asylum from religious persecution in a new land. Asymmetric means not identical on both sides of a dividing central line. For example, because one eyebrow was set markedly higher than the other, William's face had a particularly asymmetric appearance. Atavism means resemblance to remote ancestors rather than to parents. For example, the doctors ascribed the child's deformity to an atavism. Atheistic means denying the existence of God. For example, his atheistic remarks shocked the religious worshippers. Atlas means a bound volume of maps, charts. For example, embarrassed at being unable to distinguish Slovenia from Slovakia, George W. finally consulted an atlas. Atone means make amends for, pay for. For example, he knew no way in which he could atone for his brutal crime. Atrocity means brutal deed. For example, in time of war, many atrocities are committed by invading armies. Atrophy means wasting away. For example, polio victims need physiotherapy to prevent the atrophy of affected limbs. Attain means achieve or accomplish, gain. For example, the scarecrow sought to attain one goal, he wished to obtain a brain. Attentive means alert and watchful, considerate, thoughtful. For example, spellbound, the attentive audience watched the final game of the tennis match, never taking their eyes from the ball. Attenuate means make thin, weaken. For example, by withdrawing their forces, the generals hoped to attenuate the enemy lines. Attest means testify, bear witness. For example, having served as a member of the grand jury, I can attest that our system of indicting individuals is in need of improvement. Attribute means essential quality. For example, his outstanding attribute was his kindness. Attribute means ascribe, explain. For example, I attribute her success in science to the encouragement she received from her parents. Attrition means gradual decrease in numbers. For example, in the 1960s urban churches suffered from attrition as members moved from the cities to the suburbs. Atypical means not normal. For example, the child psychiatrist reassured Mrs. Keaton that playing doctor was not atypical behavior for a child of young Alex's age. Audacious means daring, bold. For example, audiences cheered as Luke Skywalker and Princess Leia made their audacious, death-defying leap to freedom, escaping Darth Vader's troops. Audit means examination of accounts. For example, when the bank examiners arrived to hold their annual audit, they discovered the embezzlements of the chief cashier. Auditory means pertaining to the sense of hearing. For example, Audrey suffered from auditory hallucinations. She thought Elvis was speaking to her from the great beyond. Augment means increase, add to. For example, armies augment their forces by calling up reinforcements. Teachers augment their salaries by taking odd jobs. Augury means omen, prophecy. For example, he interpreted the departure of the birds as an augury of evil. August means impressive, majestic. For example, visiting the palace at Versailles, she was impressed by the august surroundings in which she found herself. Aureole means sun's corona, halo. For example, many medieval paintings depict saintly characters with aureoles around their heads. Auroral means pertaining to the aurora borealis. For example, the auroral display was particularly spectacular that evening. Auspicious means favoring success. For example, with favorable weather conditions, it was an auspicious moment to set sail. Austere means severely simple and unornamented. For example, the headmaster's austere demeanor tended to scare off the more timid students, who never visited his study willingly. Authenticate means prove genuine. For example, an expert was needed to authenticate the original Van Gogh painting, distinguishing it from its imitation. Authoritarian means completely dominating another's will. For example, the leaders of the authoritarian regime ordered the suppression of the democratic protest movement. Authoritative means having the weight of authority. For example, impressed by the young researcher's well-documented presentation, we accepted her analysis of the experiment as authoritative. Autocratic means having absolute, unchecked power. For example, someone accustomed to exercising authority may become autocratic if his or her power is unchecked. Automaton means mechanism that imitates actions of humans. For example, long before science fiction readers became aware of robots, writers were presenting stories of automatons who could outperform men. Autonomous means self-governing. For example, although the University of California at Berkeley is just one part of the state university system, in many ways Cal Berkeley is autonomous, for it runs several programs that are not subject to outside control. Autopsy means examination of a dead body, post-mortem. For example, the medical examiner ordered an autopsy to determine the cause of death. Auxiliary means helper, additional, or subsidiary. For example, to prepare for the emergency, they built an auxiliary power station. Avalanche means great mass of falling snow and ice. For example, the park ranger warned the skiers to stay on the main trails, where they would be in no danger of being buried beneath a sudden avalanche. Avarice means greediness for wealth. For example, King Midas is a perfect example of avarice, for he was so greedy that he wished everything he touched would turn to gold. Avenge means take vengeance for something. For example, Hamlet vowed he would avenge his father's murder and punish Claudius for his horrible crime. Averse means reluctant, disinclined. For example, the reporter was averse to revealing the sources of his information. Aversion means firm dislike. For example, Bert had an aversion to yuppies, Alex had an aversion to punks. Avert means prevent, turn away. For example, she averted her eyes from the dead cat on the highway. Aviary means enclosure for birds. For example, the aviary at the zoo held nearly 300 birds. Avid means greedy, eager for. For example, he was avid for learning and read everything he could get. Avocation means secondary or minor occupation. For example, his hobby proved to be so fascinating and profitable that gradually he abandoned his regular occupation and concentrated on his avocation. Avow means declare openly. For example, Lana avowed that she never meant to steal Debbie's boyfriend, but no one believed her avowal of innocence. Avuncular means like an uncle. For example, avuncular pride did not prevent him from noticing his nephew's shortcomings. Awe means solemn wonder. For example, the tourists gazed with awe at the tremendous expanse of the Grand Canyon. Awry means distorted, crooked. For example, he held his head awry, giving the impression that he had caught cold in his neck during the night. Axiom means self-evident truth requiring no proof. For example, before a student can begin to think along the lines of Euclidean geometry, he must accept certain principles or axioms. Azure means sky blue. For example, azure skies are indicative of good weather. End of the word list with words starting with letter A.